All right, and we're live. Welcome, 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 everybody, to the NESS Book Club, where we have an awesome panel of guests who are going to discuss a classic sword and sorcery story from the 20th century. And where you, the listeners at home or wherever you're listening from, are encouraged to have read the story previously, and that way you can participate in this discussion via the chat. So, welcome in, everyone. If you are catching us on the replay, then feel free to hit pause, go read the story, and come back and enjoy the discussion as it unfolds. So, as is the New Edge Sword and Sorcery way, we hope these discussions can help bring new perspectives to the genre of Blood and Thunder and Fuse. And in that on that note, we will get started. So I'm going to ask each guest to introduce themselves, starting with J.M. Clarke.
Hello, everybody. I'm J.M. Clarke. I am a writer of sorts. I write in the sword and sorcery genre. I write the Kiembe and Worry stories, which have appeared in Book of Blades and New Edge of Sword and Sorcery. Vapors of Zanai and the Rise of the Demon have appeared in issues 0 and 2. I've also write in the progression fantasy genre, Mark of the Fool being my largest work there, and yeah, I'm just an author that has opinions. I'm just a guy with opinions here. That's basically all there is to me.
Well, that is what we are here for, your opinions. So, Prashanth.
Hey everyone. My name is Prashanth. I'm a writer from India, and my debut novel came out earlier this year, The Spice Gate, which is more along the lines of epic fantasy. I have written sword and sorcery in the past, and I've had a couple of stories in Heroic Fantasy Quarterly and a couple of stories in the New Age Sword and Sorcery magazines as well. So yeah, very excited to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
And we are super happy to have you. Molly.
Thank you.
I'm Molly Tanzer. I'm a writer and editor. Uh, I am the author of the forthcoming Jarell story that's in the next issue of New Edge Sword and Sorcery. So we've been working with the estate of C.L. Moore to revive that character. So I'm really excited about that. I'm a novelist. I have a bunch of books out. I have a forthcoming sword and sorcery story in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and I have a Tor.com novella later. It's actually going to be in 2026. So don't hold your breath for that one, but it will be out soon. So yeah, it's fun. I'm really excited to be talking about sword and sorcery. It's been like a lifelong interest of mine. So I'm glad to be back in the fold of sort of communicating with people about that and talking about it. So.
And we are happy to have you doing it. So, huzzah! I am your host, Valerie Valdes. I am the author of the Chilling Effect trilogy and the space fantasy novel Where Peace is Lost, as well as, perhaps more importantly, I have a short story in the forthcoming Bleeding Hearts and Battle Axes, brought to you by New Edge Sword and Sorcery. So, without any further ado, let us jump in to our discussion of this story. For those who have not read The Dark Eidolon, go away and come back and read it. And no. Just a quick summary of the story, and I'm going to not dig into spoilers so that we can get into the questions faster. But here we have the story of two bad guys. We have Namira, who is a dark sorcerer, and we have Zotula, who is an emperor, and they are essentially pitted against each other because once upon a time, Zotula, when our sorcerer was a young beggar, Zotula trampled over him with his horse and hurt him, and thus was born a revenge fantasy that lasted way beyond Count of Monte Cristo levels of revenge fantasy. So, the story progresses as the revenge fantasy is carried out through a series of biblical, horrifying events, and it culminates in just the most epic "Am I the asshole? Everyone sucks here" known to man. So, with all of that said, we are going to then jump into the questions. Yes, some folks just read it. Very good. Some folks read it for their own pleasure, their own edification. Some read it to be able to participate in this discussion. We welcome all of you who have participated in this story event. But I'm going to start with Molly for question number 1, which is who are we supposed to be rooting for in this story? Because this is, as I said, an "Am I the Asshole" post on Reddit, and everyone sucks here. But who do you think who are our main characters, and who are we supposed to be wanting to win in this one?
I was rooting for the concubine, honestly, because we've got these like 2 jerks, and they're just being jerks to one another in increasingly ridiculous ways. But I was really into. I'm trying to find her name. I should have like taken notes on this, but
I believe it's Obexa.
Obexa, yeah, no, she like. I guess I was like. She doesn't have a lot going on, but the moment, and I'm sorry if this is, I think this is okay to talk about like R-rated stuff on this, but there's this moment where like they go to the dinner that he has thrown for them, and she's like, that guy fucks, and I want to know what it's like. And I'm like, that is such a weird moment to have in this story about like spirit horses and mummies, and she's just like, wondering about this guy, and I was like, that I'm rooting for her now. She does not make it out alive, but the fact that was even on her mind in that circumstance, that's my girl. Like, I'm going with her. That's who I want to win. She does not. It's okay. But
and he's not described in particularly attractive, glowing terms. He's got a big Skeletor vibe going on, and yet
he does. But at the same time, like given sort of the monster genre, and also I edit like Japanese manga for a living, and so like I guess I just was like, yeah, sure, whatever. But like I feel like the genre of like monster like lovers, she would be an avid reader of like she'd be on Spicy Book Talk being like, I don't want the abs having fairy guys, I want Skeletor porn. And that's my girl. So that's
she's here for the Kraken love anyway. But yes,
absolutely. Yeah. So I'm just gonna you called on me first, but that's my answer. Like I'm going with her. So
it is a valid answer, and as far as we know, she survives, and so we don't know exactly what happens, but I don't think she died. I don't think they said she was
horse
dead.
Come back to trample the house where she is. Isn't that where
I guess it does.
I figured it was the rocks fall, everybody died.
You know what? You're probably right, actually.
I hope she got out. I hope she finds her Skeletor boyfriend. Like, I don't know, but I don't know if I hope.
The Satan protected just her. That's our new headcanon, even if it's not real. Prashanth.
I think during the course of the story, I was kind of rooting for Namira at first, right? Like we know that there was injustice done against him. Though I mean, I couldn't understand why Clarke Ashton Smith had to go with Narthos as a name for a guy who had really bad things happen to him. I mean, Narthos is a pretty evil name, like. I was like, okay, you could have taken a more sympathetic name for a character. But yeah, I mean, that aside, I was rooting for Narthos and later Namira for a while. And then later on, as I kept, as his villainy started coming out, I was like, okay, no, not him. Definitely not Zodula, who's just kind of this rich guy in a ruling over an empire. Somewhere along the way, I kept thinking that this is a slice of life tale in the life of an archdemon. The archdemon, what's his name? I think Poseidon.
Yeah.
We don't know much about him unless obviously we've read some other works of Clarke Ashton Smith. But there is somewhere in this tale where Clarke Ashton Smith, like he's the one guy who kind of gets away with everything in this. He's been quite unbiased throughout the story. He's like, hey, look, I know you're pissed off to Namira, right? There's been some wrong done to you and you're trying to set things right, but you don't need to kind of really go overboard over here. Okay, so I was rooting for the guy who was trying to make sense over here. Right, and at least towards the end, initially I was like, okay, you know what, Zodula something bad needs to happen to him, and something bad does happen to him. But yeah, okay, just like stop it there. You didn't need to call these post-apocalyptic horses and trample your entire world over there, right? So yeah, at that point I was like, okay, you know what, this Poseidon dude sitting inside this statue with a mace on top, I think that guy is making sense, and I was rooting for him.
Yeah, he was the I'm gonna need you all to just get along here actually. Even though you really hate this guy, he's actually one of my good worshippers and I'm not into this whole tearing him down entirely thing. Like you could have your revenge fantasy quietly, but but yeah, that is a very valid point that at some point it's like the camera pulls back, right? And and you are not even in any of these two characters. It's this entirely different guy who's more distant and more elevated, aloof from it. Trish says, in fact, the demon may well be the most sympathetic character here. Yeah. Between the demon and the concubine. That's it. That's all we got here. Now everybody else we're like, you could go. We'll back up to some more reader comments after we hear from JM Clarke. Let's go.
Hello. So I must admit, at first I started off. Well, at first I didn't know what to root for because the story starts off and they're like, here's this super evil, ultimate evil guy named Namira. And I'm like, okay, that's the bad guy. And then he turned out to be the main character, which was interesting to me. But I think the moment I started rooting for him pretty hard and then got off those tracks in a later part of the story. But what won me over for a bit was his level of hilarious pettiness. Like, this man has unlimited cosmic power, and the first thing he does is pick an empty lot beside the Emperor's palace and build a bigger house than him and go, I'm your neighbor now, deal with it. Which, like, that's mad. That's a mad flex. Like, that is, oh my god, every person that has ever been like shit on by an HOA, like, that's the fantasy right there. And then he then proceeds to continue to take his unlimited cosmic power and like just engage in petty pranks, like ghost horses running across the palace and stuff like that, like literally just irritating Zatula. Like, that's all he was doing for the longest time, which, like, that level of pettiness was absolutely beautiful. I was in love with it, and I'm like, if this is going to be Namira's whole character, he is going to be like one of the most towering protagonists of all time. It's going to be amazing. But of course, we had to go the route of tragedy, wherein, of course, Namira then decides to upgrade his level of vengeance. And very interesting moment where Poseidon, like, we usually see deities or companions going, oh no, revenge is not the right way, but like the super ultimate demon lord going, nah, revenge isn't all it's cracked up to be, was like a weird moment for me, not going to lie. But by that point, when I realized where Namira was going, though I did root for Rebecca a little bit too, because walking in going, what's under that robe, was kind of amazing. But I think by the end of it, I realized we're sort of watching the fall of the House of Ulster here, or Usher rather, and where the building is coming down, and by that point there is no one left to root for. You're watching the Greek tragedy play out, and the players are all being destroyed. By that point, you are watching the play of fate, in my opinion. So by the end, it was less me rooting for someone and more just watching the events play out where Namira's own flaws undid him. So that's where I was sitting with that by the end. But that pettiness, it was glorious for a while.
It really was, wasn't it? It was definitely just. I love the way you describe it as, I'm just going to build this house right next to this guy that I hate and just harass him endlessly because I can.
I can totally imagine Namira, just before he executes this long revenge, like sitting in in the desert and having like this whiteboard where he's plotting all horse themed vengeance. Like, okay, I need to make Zatula realize that it has something to do with horses. So let me come up with all the plans that's gonna really piss him off.
Just this murder board of like horse stuff that it's like, what can I do? Horses. Just writes horses at the top and then just proceeds to like brainstorm.
Yeah, so that is really petty. I agree with JM.
And I think that pettiness is sort of a hallmark of his character, is that even though, like you said originally, he was clearly wronged, and so you have that sort of sense of, okay, this is a warranted revenge because he was harmed in the first place. But even Poseidon steps in and is like, Yeah, but consider, if he hadn't done that to you, you wouldn't be where you are right now. You'd still be some beggar on the street doing nothing, and now you're like the most powerful sorcerer in the world. Couldn't you maybe be okay with that and just
No,
go?
no.
No,
Chill.
What are you like? What
Chill,
are you?
bro.
This is why you're not Sorcerer Supreme
because
of Zucky. Like, you're not like, I am going to get this guy so hard that no one's ever got this hard before. And I think that drive is what you really need to be like a successful wizard in that way. So
Mhm.
you gotta have that ambition.
Yeah.
You gotta rise to the challenge.
Absolutely.
Oliver says, I think the concubine betraying her past lover was a reference to an earlier Zothique tale. Oh, because Trish had pointed out that the concubine is another one who sucks here because of the fact that she had betrayed her former lover because she got bored with him.
Hey, whomst among us? I just, it's, girl has to do what she's got to do. So that's still coming down on her side.
It's a hard knock life for concubines. Before we does anyone have any last thoughts before we move to the next question, because I feel like it leads off from something that JM just said. So, but any other final thoughts on the characters here before we slide sideways?
One final thing I'll say is that it would have been kind of amazing if, when Poseidon was like, I can't let you take horrible revenge on Zatula, like, Namira's like, okay, well, just petty revenge for the next 60 years it is. Just ghost horses every night. Like, technically not ruining your servants, destroying him, but, he's not going to have a good time. But alas. But yeah, that's all. That's the final thing I'll say.
And in a way, wouldn't that have been more satisfying to have 60 years of watching that dude suffer instead of just bringing it all down at once? Yeah, no, it's a thing to think about.
Strangely short-sighted for someone who, is playing the longest of long games with his horse-themed revenge.
Yeah, you would think, right, that he would maybe have a little more patience, but I guess not. He reached his breaking point. That was it. He was like, this is the time. This is when we're going to make this happen. So, Christopher thinks that the story might be in volume 4 of the Nightshade collected stories. So that might be Obexa's story, may be located in there. What even am I without my angry backstory? Says Trish. Indeed. And we also have another comment says, hard to have a plot when your main character likes stability and does zero self-sabotage. Facts. But that also kind of leads into our next question, which is the plot here does unfold in a fairly linear way, and I think JM's bringing up Greek tragedy as an example is a good one. So how does the story then end up maintaining tension and make you want to keep reading as we go through this, what is again a fairly linear revenge fantasy? And I'm gonna start with Prashanth on this one. Like, how does this keep us going? How does this keep us reading? How does this plot function? How does it work?
I think the escalation was done pretty well. It's like, see, the way the story begins is, that this guy Sotula has done some pretty dark and stupid shit, and he's pissed off Namira, which is fine. So he's got something coming for him, right? And as a reader, when I was reading the story, I knew that something is coming for him, and he deserves that, right? And I want to know what he's getting, and I'm reading for that. And as JM put it, when all the pettiness starts, the way it escalates, right? It starts with just being your neighbor, and then there are all these spectral, phantasmic horse tramplings that are happening around your palace, which is really freaking everybody out. And then you have these dancing mummies and skeletons who kind of throw you a guard of honor so that you can go and have a pretty fancy lunch, right? With your neighbor. And there's this sense of escalation, there's the sense of building up that's happening. All the while, there's also this slow, how do I put it, like a character reveal. Like, as I was initially inclined towards sympathizing with Obixa as well, but then somewhere along the way, I also saw that no, you know what, even she's done some pretty wicked shit in the past, like, right, and Namira uses that to kind of traumatize them, or kind of like keep them on the hooks. And that actually kept me going. Like, hey, you know what? There's no good character in here from having like 2 or 3 good characters. So who exactly is going to win this battle, and why should they win this battle? And I think that kept me going, even though the story was pretty linear. Like, I wanted to reach that last page and see, like, there are these bunch of like bad guys all gathered up in this dinner party, right? And there's this archdemon who is kind of overseeing everything. There is this eldritch god who has been kind of contracted to do some carnage. So who's going to come out of it? And I think that kept me going. And obviously, I mean, we don't need to talk much about Clarke's amazing language. So there's a large part of me that wanted to keep reading simply because the prose was just so alluring and the prose was just so gripping. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty much it for me.
And we are definitely going to discuss the pros in a separate question for sure, because yeah, there's a lot to
Yeah.
talk about there, I think. JM.
So a couple of things kept me going. To quote my friend, another progression fantasy writer, who I ended up showing this story to, and he loved it. The imagery goes hard, and it really, really does. And I found that pulled me through a lot of what was going on, even though I sort of knew what the conclusion was from the moment that Namira made that fatal choice. But I find, at least for me personally, one of the allures of reading tragedies is the always ever so faint hope that the character who has the tragic flaw will, at the last second or just before the last second, go, wait, what am I doing? No, I'm backing out of this, type of thing. And to me, that's where the tension of tragedy comes from. And for me, it was the hope of, okay, is there going to be a point where Namira, like, okay, he sees he's crashing the plane, is he gonna pull up? Like, that was the final point of tension for me. And of course, it's very rare that a tragedy actually does have a character like pull up at the last second, but I think it's that hope that for me personally kept me going. And I love Namira's pettiness. If he seemed like he'd be a very interesting character if he did happen to back out of it. So that's enough to gave me the hope to keep going. And yeah, that's what pulled me along, despite the fact that it did conclude rather classically.
Yeah, it went very Titus Andronicus on us there, right? Like, yeah. Molly.
Well, it's funny because you were asking your question and I was reading it and I was like, with no shade intended here, but like, is mounting tension why I come to Clarke Ashton Smith? And the answer to that is really like, no. I think that he is such a different writer than like Lovecraft or Howard. And I love that about him. And I love that it is sort of just like, let's take this ride together. And I think he requires a lot more buy-in than Howard or Lovecraft. And I think that's why he isn't really quite as famous, unless you're like into like the Weird Tales crew and like that kind of part of the fiction of that's the pulp fiction of that part of the century. Because yeah, like it is such a slow burn. And it's really, if you let yourself sort of escape from the thought of like, where is this going? Like, what am I like? Why should I care about these people? If you like if you do away with all of the things that any like 101 writing blog is going to tell you to try to do in a story, then like you can really see what he's doing, which is like he's building mood. He's using language that you need to go to the dictionary for. He's doing all these things. And it really actually reminded me much more of less of like a story that I read in a book and more like I was watching like a silent film. Because if you watch a lot of those, they are just like a show, right? Like they're showing you this amazing sort of like landscape, right? Of like, sorry, like what is going on with birds? So like it is kind of taking you on this ride as you go along. And I think that's really cool about it. Like, I think it reminded me a lot of like watching like Metropolis or like other sort of silent films of that era that don't really have like rising action, falling, like they're not concerned with that at all. They are definitely just like an entertainment. And I think that's what I really like about it. So one of the things that kind of kept me going with this and with a lot of like Clarke Ashton Smith stories is just seeing like what kind of rules that he is breaking that like I like, and I love that about him because yeah, you don't really see that as much anymore. And yeah, I would totally watch. I mean, it's like the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society did that amazing like silent film version of Call of Cthulhu like a million years ago, and I would love to see them do some Clarke Ashton Smith stuff, just because I think like it would really translate to like a very similar like medium. So
Yeah, I think that you are absolutely right in terms of structurally this is way past 101, like creative writing 101 type stuff. And to me, what it felt the most like was Thomas Ligotti's The Red Tower,
mm,
in that that is a story about a place. It doesn't even have characters. It is just an experiential sort of tale where you're being drawn through this location and being told in exquisite detail about it. And there's this kind of just sense of mounting horror and discovery that I think people have that same feeling when they're reading like Annihilation, for example, Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, especially in certain parts of the exploration of the ruins and stuff like that. Which I haven't read that, so I'm only getting that secondhand. But something like the Red Tower, this felt a lot like that, except it was, instead of an exploration of a place, it was an exploration of the vengeance, of an exploration of a very specific form of revenge. And so it was just like this long series of things happening, but you wanted to see them happen. You wanted to watch the play. You wanted to watch the silent film. I think that's a great way of describing it. It's just this parade of horrors. Yeah, it was good stuff. Good stuff. Any other final thoughts on the structure of this and the narrative drive of it before we go to our next question? All right. No, all good, all good. I'm actually I'm going to do the question slightly out of order because since Prashanth brought up his prose, I want to get talking with that. We're going to start with JM for this one, but how does Smith's prose kind of contribute to the just everything? I mean, how does it build this story? How does it buttress the story? How is it the walls and the foundation and the roof of this entire damn story? His prose is a lot. How does it carry us through here? The description, the details, the evil incantations. Let's talk about the words.
Well, the prose, first of all, personally, I found the prose to be fantastic. And the one thing that I found was there were two things that I found it did for me. One, it was incredibly immersive, it had a massive amount of detail. And one thing I find about reading old writers, especially old sword and sorcery writers, is that the language, is used, even if we use big obscure words in the modern day, the way things are phrased are slightly different. And the further that we go away from like the 1930s temporally, the more that difference expands. And what I really like about that is that when you're reading a tale of alien magics and strange aeons and stuff like that, the language being slightly uncannily out of sync with modern English, I find adds to that feeling of escaping into a strange realm where things don't quite make sense in the way that you're used to. And I found that not only and I found that even for a writer of his era, he especially goes for the macabre in terms of descriptions, which absolutely and totally helps build the image of this utter destruction, these towering evils. And I think if the story were more simply phrased, we wouldn't go there. We wouldn't be in this nightmare realm that is Namira's Tower, and we wouldn't understand the strange, rotted splendors of Zetula's court because the richness of the language is necessary to convey that. And though, one additional thing there I have to say is that every writer who's written a modern necromancer needs to be ashamed of themselves because, good lord, those skeletons were dripped out of their minds. They were dressed to the nines. They meant business. They had their parasuits on. Oh man, it was so cool. And I will also say one particular moment I want to zoom in on is when the court is being called out by Namira's undead servants. You have the words spoken by the mummified kings, and then this entire menagerie of scavenging beasts repeat their words, which is one of the and which then culminates in this almost hypnotic song, which is one of the creepiest, most alien ways to convey information I have ever encountered. And I think that those choices further introduce you into, not only is this magic, but this is a strange alien magic that should be dreaded.
Yeah, he went past the site, and he went out to space. Actually, at one point, it literally talks about calling these entities from space the darkness of space. Molly.
Well, I think it's interesting because, like, I've been trying to figure out like how I want to talk about this, but like basically he was such a huge fan of like Gothic novels, and I think that comes through in his prose, because like the Gothic, especially the ones that he was into, like Vathek, like they really do sort of have this like long, slow burn, like settle in, like we're going to take our time with this language, we're going to take our time with the action, we're going to build this up. And I think that this story is, it's really apparent sort of the fact that he had this like fascination with that style and that form. And I think it works really well. And I like that he's applying, because like, I mean, I feel like if I was going to talk to him, I think he, like me, would be like, the Gothic is great, but like, like we need sorcerers on page 1. Like, why do I have to read 400 pages to get to like this guy in the woods? Like, no, like cut to the chase, guys, he's not really a cut to the chase writer at all, but he does want like the monster or the sorcerer like in the story on the page immediately. And so it is interesting to kind of see that in his work. And I think that's one of the reasons that he's such an interesting writer. And like, while I don't usually like to sort of engage in like biographical criticism, because like obviously that's like, I think we're back, the pendulum has swung back towards it a little bit, but like it's hard and it's problematic. But he was agoraphobic, he had a lot of problems, he lived in the same cabin for like a lot of his life, and books were his companion. And so I think you can really see, I think a little bit you can kind of see that in his style and his structure, where he's like thought a lot about what he likes in the books, and he puts that right there up front, like immediately. And and so that's one of the things that I was like really engaged by, was that like there's no buildup. This is not at the Mountains of Madness, man. Like there is no like description of the equipment we're going to use to look at these rocks. Like it is ultimate from like moment one that this is a story about like evil, like it's like, because it's almost like a Gothic version, like a crazy Gothic version of The Prince and the Pauper, right? Because there's that interaction, and then it like and then it kind of splits off into that. So that's what I was kind of thinking about when I was reading it.
Definitely. Like you said, he's just from moment one. It's like, we're going to start with a poem. It's a messed up poem. We're going to dive right into describing the messed up world. It's got sorcerers. It's got gods. It's got emperors, and everyone's evil. Let's do this for sure.
Yeah. It definitely has that like Dying Earth kind of vibe, which I also really like, because I'm a huge like Jack Vance weirdo. And so like, that's another thing that I like sort of about this setting, is it does have that sort of like the sun is no longer bright. Like it's the last continent, like, and we have this whole sort of like weird milieu in which we can put like the very, very unusual characters doing unusual things in unusual settings. And it's really neat. Like it's a cool illusion that he sort of maintains.
It's sort of a Hobbesian, like we're descending into savagery sort of situation, where everyone sucks here again, going back to our Reddit in the beginning, and it's not going to get better. You don't have that sense of, oh no, but it's okay, we've got hope on the horizon. Nope, it's just everything's gonna go downhill from here. Prashanth.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what Molly just said. I was thinking back to how Clarke Ashton Smith is someone who is agoraphobic, and he grew up in this cabin, right, which his parents had left for him, and he spent most of his life over there writing these stories. And I can imagine that how words for him suddenly started getting the main character energy, right? For him that, and in this story as well, like. The prose itself starts to take the form of some level of character, like, and that is something that keeps the reader hooked, like more than the complicated nature or the simplified nature of the story. It's not a very complex story. It's a revenge story. It's quite straightforward, but the way he builds that story up is something that is entirely credited to his prose style. And as a writer, like I'm gonna now like unpeel every single story that Clarke Ashton Smith has ever written, just to find out the different ways in which it describes a sunset. And even in this one story, there were at least like 3 or 4 different ways in which he, and this is a dark eldritch elder gods kind of a story, right? And he still manages to carve out these really grotesque but sometimes really beautiful sunsets. And as a writer, the craftsman in me is like, wow, this is setting the mood. Right? and and yeah, and it definitely keeps me hooked. Like at one point, I'm just like, explain to me how this tower looks like and who are these characters and what do they do. And the entire performance where that Namira sets up for Satula in during the feast is something that both builds up character, it builds up his dominance, his pettiness, all of that. And all of that is credited to the prose. JM used a great word, macabre, and it was macabre. um, and it just really fits in the kind of story that he wants to tell. And yeah, and I think as writers we do need to kind of think about how our prose style influences the kind of story that we want to tell. And I think Clarke Ashton Smith does a great job of that.
Yeah, I think calling out the beauty of it is very accurate. It is like it's the beauty of death and decay. It's the beauty of those horrifying bloody fungal mushrooms that grow in the sides of trees. It's the beauty of some kind of fractalized mold spiraling off of a rotting pumpkin or something. It's beautiful, but in a very horrifying way. And the language that he uses to describe it is just it is so crisp and vivid and lush. It's everything. It's
Very
awesome.
vivid, very vivid. I still remember that one phrase where he describes something like a fruit that is ripening over an abyss, but the fruit does not fall,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And I still have that, and I still have that imagery in my mind, right? And yeah, it's fantastic how he manages to weave these words into this. And sometimes I don't know. It's interesting how sometimes I don't care whether those metaphors make sense, because it's
Right?
it's somehow still contributing to that atmosphere that he's building. And I think that's something that's really interesting about Clarke Ashton Smith, because he just delves so deep into that language, where if you start to really take a step back and look at it, you're going to be like, hey, that comparison or that word does not make sense. But when you're into the story, somehow it does, and that's credit to his craft.
Yeah. I think oh gosh, who was it? Now I can't remember who it was, but had this notion of sword and sorcery metaphors and imagery, often involving stuff that is, if not oxymoronic, then that kind of clashing type stuff where this shouldn't make sense, but it does in the weird way that sword and
Yeah.
sorcery does. And so I think that's a really great thing to bring up in terms of the prose and the imagery here, for sure, for sure. Any final thoughts on that before we go on to our next discussion question here? This is such a great place to talk, so I'm just
Fun.
like, I don't want to rush us.
I have a friend who I once really annoyed by being like, you don't have to worry that this. I was giving a crit of his work, and it was like, you don't have to worry that this doesn't make sense, because it makes fantasy sense. And I often sort of think about like fantasy sense versus, and there's also that sort of, there's night stories, there's day stories, there's dream stories, and I think it understands its idiom so well that I think it does. You will like let it go if you are sort of like, what do you mean, like a fruit that never fell over this ripening? I texted that line to a friend of mine because I was just like, this is the story I'm reading right now today. And I think sort of if you let yourself, it's like it makes sense to them. It makes sense. I feel like he's good at conveying, even though there's not like a character's point of view in this. If there's definitely like a narrator who's telling us the story, I think like the characters in it would understand it. And so it is sort of like that the narrator is part of this world. It's not like someone from our world that's telling the story. It's someone from that world that's telling us that story. And that was sort of interesting me about the writing in it. Like from that sort of sense of like who is it that is recording this, like who is it, how are we receiving this transmission from the past or the future? And I like to think about those kinds of things, but it's also like, I don't know, it's some guy who lives there. He's definitely intimately familiar with this world. He's not an outside observer.
Yeah. This is someone who is able to use the language of the world, the plane, as it were, to describe all of the intricacies of it in just very vivid and lush ways. And I think that we have someone saying Smith was heavily influenced by Baudelaire, so Death and Decay are strong in his work. Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense to have that as a strong influence for sure. And I mean, again, Molly evoked some like the Gothics, who themselves kind of came out of the Romantics. So there's definitely a progression here of language and wanting to be very evocative and lush in that, I think. Yeah, it's real good stuff, y'all. That's it. That's the tweet. So yeah, as noted, if you do have any questions for the guests, please type them up. We'll share them. We have a couple more questions to go, but we are extremely happy to jettison them and take audience questions instead, and or try to get to everything before the end of our talk here. So our next question then. Does this story employ any tropes that would eventually become hallmarks of the genre? Because we're reading all of these kinds of formative sword and sorcery stories that came about early in the development of it. So anything in here that stood out to you as like, oh, I remember seeing this in a later story. It's like, oh, this is very Moorcock, or this is very Vance, like. And anything like that you think, oh, I remember seeing this later. This is kind of one of the progenitors of it. And we're going to start with Molly for this one.
I already like went on and on about Jack Vance. But yeah, I guess he was sort of and I guess also like, I feel like sort of like Michael Shea, who, ended up taking over some of the Dying Earth, I think, books from like the Cudgel books from Jack Vance. He also, I feel like, is in this tradition, the Clarke Ashton Smith tradition, rather than like the Tolkien tradition or anything like that. Because he also is just sort of like, yeah, we're going, like, blink and you're going to miss all of this stuff. Like, you need to be fully engaged all the time. And I think about my favorite book of his that I recommend, even though it's like really hard to get because it's out of print, but it's called Inyana, The Touch of Undying. And, I always think about Clarke Ashton Smith when I revisit that book, because it is like the protagonist is just this like little guy. He's just like kind of like a jerk academic who gets swept up in events and ends up trying to search for immortality, and is taken to all these different places and meets like wizards and meets demons, and there's like kind of Shoggoths at one point. And so like I do kind of think that I think sometimes when you look at authors, like it's interesting to be like, well, who obviously did this person read? And I feel like Vance and Shea definitely are in that tradition, and you can sort of see like the Howard people and the Lovecraft people and the Smith people, and I really, really enjoy that when you sort of stumble across somebody who's like, no, like Lovecraft's just too mainstream for me. Like I need the much weirder version of like the pulp aesthetic. And so I'm not sure who else I would name, but those are the two that really came to mind.
I just love the notion. It's like Lovecraft is over here like, this is too eldritch and unfathomable, and I will not describe it to you because you can't comprehend it. And Clarke Ashton Smith is like, here is 2 pages of description, everybody. I got you, fam. Like
here's
real.
What these skeletons look like. Like, I'm going to give you every detail about them. And like, yeah, absolutely.
Prashanth.
I'm still remembering the descriptions of those skeletons and the way they kind of all march towards that to the palace to invite Sathula. No, but coming back to the question, somewhere reading around while reading the story, I kept asking myself like, this is a story that's a lot more sorcery than sword, right? I mean, but it still is very much quintessentially sword and sorcery. Right, which makes me kind of ask the question then, like, is there a right balance that we always seek to have when we say what makes a sword and sorcery story, or what are these tropes that kind of fulfill that need that we say that, okay, you know what, this is what makes a sword and sorcery story. And honestly, I did think this was a great sword and sorcery story for reasons that one of the things that I always look for or enjoy about those kind of stories is this unhinged epic nature of the prose, right? And that is something that has been repetitive over the course of time. Obviously, not to the eldritch level of Poe or Lovecraft or this Clarke Ashton Smith, but that is something that I always grew up reading and enjoying. And like by the time we come to the 80s and 90s and the present day, I feel like we're kind of like uh, losing our touch on how epic we want our stories to be, or we are afraid of kind of going a little unhinged. And and I think this story does that really well. And this is something that I feel like more and more writers need to take this forward. At least those who want to write these great epic stories, right? And I think that is, I don't know if it can be counted as a trope per se, but I would say this is more of a trope in terms of a craft thing and a subgenre kind of a thing, right? Now I haven't honestly read a lot of 30s or 40s sword and sorcery. This is one of the few stories that I have, but yeah, I think for me this is something that really caught my eye, and yeah.
Absolutely. And we're not going to get into the hard versus soft magic, you know,
Yeah.
Brandon Sanderson school of you must explain everything debate here. But I think that what you bring up does speak to that kind of, this is very soft magic in the sense of, while it's very exquisitely explained and detailed to the point that we get actual invocations and spells basically spelled out for us here, nonetheless, how any of it works, I don't know. You
With
have a
yeah.
you make a deal with demons and gods and space creatures, and that's it. That's all you get. That's all the explanation you get, aside from the exquisite detailing of all of the actual spellcasting.
Yeah, and
Jan.
that
Oh,
still
sorry.
keeps
Go ahead.
you. Oh, sorry. No,
No,
go
no,
ahead, go ahead, go
Prashanth.
ahead.
No, Prashanth. Go.
No, I just meant that the those lack of rules that contemporary fantasy writers want to kind of incorporate or give their readers to get a feeling of saying that, hey, you know what, I understand this magic system from the start to the end. Here's the rule book that you want. And Clarke Ashton Smith is like, nah, that's not happening. Here, I'm going to sit on top of space and call an eldritch horror, right? And that was actually a very interesting paragraph where he breaks all rules, where his tower is almost stretching above the stars, right? And he's looking down upon it. And I'm like, wow, that kind of subverts everything. Like that is imagination at its best. And and yeah, and that was just great stuff. Sorry, JM, your turn. Your turn. Sorry for taking up your time.
Oh no, that's fine. It's
We have
fine.
time. We're good.
We're all friends here. But yeah, the one thing I was going to say is that on the in terms of where I think certain things were established in this story, and I will admit this is the very first Clarke Ashton Smith story I have ever read. I want more, but I it was funny because back when I read Michael Moorcock, the Elric saga, I could see how it was sort of an antithesis of Conan, but it felt like there was another influence there that I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Certain aspects of the descriptions, the strangeness, the demonicness of the magic that went farther than Howard did. And in Clarke Ashton Smith, this is probably just like this might be wrong, but it felt like I went, oh, that's where it came from, because it truly felt that Namira would have been quite at home among the Melnibonians, or rather, or vice versa. So, if you told me that, oh, there was a major influence there in that construction, I would not be surprised. But what was interesting to me is Prashanth, you talked about the hard magic versus soft magic, and Molly, you talked about how he took certain tropes present in the Gothic genre and then sped them up. And what resonated to me about both of those points is that for me, it wasn't that I saw tropes in here that influenced further sword and sorcery. I saw tropes that influenced modern fantasy. If you look at Namira, and you look at those that 3-paragraph backstory where he starts off as a beggar child and he comes to magic and gains power looking for revenge. That is a very, very, very modern retelling of like a progression fantasy story or a hard magic Brandon Sanderson-esque story, or even if you go back a little bit further, some of the epic fantasy of the 90s, not so much with the evil protagonist, but that simple start from rags, come to riches by way of magic is a very, very repeated tale throughout many, many different fantasy genres. And it kind of shocked me to see that it was here crystallized in its like, how can I put this? Almost, there's a word here that is escaping me. Distilled. There it is. It was distilled down. This entire journey that could have been its own epic fantasy series of like 10 bloody books was distilled into 3 paragraphs. And we were just told what the end of the character was. And that through line, it just thrilled me to bits to see that these sort of bones were so present in the fantasy genre, in the sword and sorcery genre, so early and in such a different form, but with such familiarity to it. So that's where I feel like that's where the story blew me away in terms of tropes reaching out from beyond time, is that it's not only later sword and sorcery, but fantasy in general, where I can see the connections and potential influences.
Yeah. To what you just said, and also kind of going back to something Molly said earlier, somebody mentioned, I think this may have been a meme or a discussion somewhere on the internet in the zeitgeist, about how if this were a Netflix series, we'd have 10 episodes of that backstory of how this guy became the greatest sorcerer necromancer in the history of this plane. And then in the last episode, he would be like, I think I'm ready to get my revenge against that guy. And then season 2. But instead, like I think Molly said earlier, it's like, no, we're just jumping right in. Here we go. Here we have here's your backstory. This is all you need to know. And now we're going to hit the ground running. So it definitely moved faster in that sense than some of the stuff that we get these days.
Yeah. And I really appreciated that, because like I'm not a huge like reader of like hard magic. I get it's such an interesting, like, seeing the hard science versus soft science applied to magic, because it's magic. And so one of my problems that with hard magic is like, well, if it can be taught like that, then it's science. Like that's actually like definitionally science. Like if you can do a control and do an experiment and like you have a hypothesis and then it works every single time, like is it magic? That's not for tonight. But like I prefer this style of fantasy where it's just like, yeah, I don't care how he summoned that guy, man. Like it's not important to the story. What is important to the story is that he sent those skeletons, or that he sent his demon horse with its like hooves that are so hot they burn stone, right? That's the juice. And I really do like that there's like all juice and no squeeze here. Like I respect it, and I think it's something that you kind of see a little bit more. I mean, like people have various opinions on like grimdark and its sort of relationship to sword and sorcery. I like a lot of grimdark fiction, and so like that's not like a dirty word to me, but I think a lot of that stuff also sort of has more of a like, I don't know, man, he's a wizard, and like I like more of that, I don't know, man, he's a wizard style of storytelling, and I would like to see it become like sort of more of a thing these days. So
yeah, it depends on my room. It depends on my mood. Sometimes I really like the breaking down and like the nitty gritty, but other times I really do like the dread that unexplainable magic really conveys, which is very hard to do with like hard magic and stuff like that. You find the odd book now and then, wherein you will have like, a more explainable kind of magic, but then you go a little bit beyond that. And it's sort of like with the scientists of the modern day, where you think you know everything until you don't, and you end up off the deep end in the dark. And that's when, to me, you just take your cake and eat it too. We think we know all of magic, but no, it's magic, and it will bite back. So that's next
thing you know, people are yelling at each other about string theory, and
I just to walk back my strong statement, like The Magic of Recluse is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. And I always, if I'm asked to list my top 10, it's in there. And that is like definitely crunchy, hard system of Magic where it's like order and chaos. And so I do really like it. I just, I do kind of also like the, like, what we all know why we're here. So.
We all
Yeah,
contain
absolutely.
multitudes. We all contain multitudes. There. Sometimes you want to eat a cupcake, and sometimes you want ice cream, and sometimes you want ice cream cake. Like, it's all good.
Yeah,
so.
that's you're right. That's true. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And now I want dessert. I've done this to myself. It's my fault. So we're going to transition to our last question, unless anyone has any more comments about the tropes. If we're all good, we're all good. And the chat discussion is so lively, but also your discussion is so good that I'm just like, sorry, chat, you're just gonna have to talk amongst yourselves because I'm listening to people and they're awesome. But then let us get to our final question here, unless we have chat questions. And so this is your last chance, chat, if you have any questions for the panelists. So for today's writers of Sword and Sorcery, what lessons do you think we can take from a story like The Dark Eidolon? And this is something that we've sort of been peppering our discussion with answers to this question throughout. But let's kind of we'll try to TLDR and sum it up now that we're here. And let's start with I think I started with Molly last time, right? So let's start with Prashanth.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just like continue with what I said earlier, is to kind of maybe writers could let loose a little bit. That is certainly one part. But I think what, again, Clarke Ashton Smith does well over here is that even though there's a lot of stuff that he's left unexplained, it doesn't pull you out of the story, right? And as a reader, I never sat and asked, who is this eldritch god who's sending out horses, or where did these mummies come from? I mean, there is an explanation to those mummies, but how did they come to serve this particular Namira? None of those were questions that I asked, because for me, in my head, Clarke Ashton Smith has built this world in such a way and has built this story in such a way that I'm waiting for the revenge, right? And I don't care how that's like building up. Like I'm fascinated by the language. I'm extremely engrossed in the world that he's built, and that kind of makes me immune to the kind of explanations or the groundedness that we seek these days in writing. And I think that is something that all of us as new writers could take a leaf out of Clarke Ashton Smith's book, where we enjoy a certain level of chaos and lawlessness, but at the same time we take care to ensure that doesn't cause the reader to pull out of the story. Because I didn't get pulled out of the story at all. And I think if there's one thing that I'd want all of us as new writers, and anyone else who's listening to this as a new writer, that's what we should take out from. Yeah.
I do like that. Yeah, JM.
I think the major lesson that I think modern sword and sorcery writers could take away is don't get dogmatic. The thing is that there's, I think, the thing is, if you go into any sword and sorcery forum, if you want to get discussion really going for a day or three, just go in and go, what is sword and sorcery? Just drop that bomb and run. You'll get 1,000 different definitions. But oftentimes what I see is a major aspect of specificity. And it's almost like I would call like a Howardian purist almost, wherein sword and sorcery, it must be an outsider character, he must be mundane, he must be afraid of magic, he must be a barbarian named Conan. Okay, maybe not quite that far, but getting there sometimes. And I think the thing is that to me, the great tragedy of that is that sword and sorcery to me is so magical because it was pre-Tolkien, it was pre-Fafford and the Grey Mouser. The rules of fantasy were not written yet; they were not set in stone. You could do whatever you want. You could get weird, you could get psychedelic, you could do anything. You could have as much or as little magic as you wished. And the thing that I think some modern sword and sorcery writers sort of get bogged down on is, okay, well, I must tell the story of the lone swordsman in a Western style encountering magic, being afraid of it, and conquering it. And I think there's no need to be afraid of spreading the magic around, having the crazed sorcerer be the main character, getting strange with it, not necessarily doing a Western-style journey or wandering into a town as the story structure. I think that's what I think people can walk away with, is that sword and sorcery, as long as long as the vibes are immaculate, you've got a good sword and sorcery story. And the vibes of Dark Eidolon were absolutely immaculate. So you take I think the takeaway is get weird, get wild, experiment, and don't be afraid of stepping out of Howard's shadow when you want to tell sword and sorcery.
Heck yeah, he's not the only one who did the thing, right? Molly.
Yeah, it's, I guess, like, I don't know, I hinted at this a little earlier, but I do think that one of the things that a writer could take away from this is that you can break every rule as long as you're good. That is like it's a great example of that, and he's a great example of that. And you know, I resist the idea that there are writing rules, and I think it's like stories like this that really show that they can be helpful, like road signs, especially when you're starting out, to kind of learn what isn't acceptable, or what isn't at least conventional, or like what helps the story along and what doesn't. Although I will say that, like, as much as I love Smith, I get impatient with him more quickly than I do with some of his contemporaries. Like when you look at something like this story and you compare it to like one of the Jarrell stories, like it's a whole different thing. And I think sometimes with sword and sorcery, you can see a lot of pastiching, which, you know, I think, again, like pastiche is great if you can do it really well, but I think it's also a really easy way to get caught up in something that isn't your own voice. And so, like, clearly, like I was saying earlier, like with like Smith and his relationship to the Gothic, like he took what he wanted out of that and he made like a whole career out of it. And so when I always suggest, when people are like, well, you know, looking at sort of questions like this, like what can we learn as writers? It's like, well, what do you like out of this? Like, what is it that calls to you? Like, build off of that. And then it won't be like, there's not the chance of being derivative. There's not the chance of pastiching unintentionally and kind of going into this old mode that maybe doesn't connect as easily with modern readers who are like scrolling their phones. But if you can find what you really love in anything, sword and sorcery, fantasy, science fiction, and then you use that as your launching point, then you will have that sort of passion and drive that's so attractive with a story like this, that maybe doesn't like zip right along. Like, it's a chewy story. And so like it makes up for it from the clear, like, laser interest of the author in relationship to the story. So I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, instead of being imitative, be transformative. Take the thing and use your dark alchemy, your dark writing alchemy, and make your philosopher's stone about it, and go from there. We are at the end of our hour, friends. Oh,
it went so fast.
Well, because y'all are awesome and said a lot of smart and cool things. So the vibes were immaculate, as JM said. So excellently done. Thank you all so much for this. If we have any final thoughts, let's get to them now. Otherwise, we're gonna outro. Last chance for audience questions, which we did have one question about: what can today's readers of Sword and Sorcery take from Clarke, Ashton, Smith? So does anybody have thoughts about that before we wrap up?
Don't be afraid to branch out, I guess, in terms of reading. I think, again, like, it can be tempting to simply engage with sword and sorcery simply through the lens of, you know, the big three, the Lieber, the Moorcock, the Howard. And I think it is very valuable to step outside of that, and even outside of their spheres of influence, which are very, very large. And you might have a great time.
I would say a good thing that I like to take away from this era of writing too is, like, don't be afraid to look up a word. Like, you might, like, it's fun to learn new words. And I sometimes think that people are advised against using like 50-cent words. And I am like, no, like, it's cool. Like, I love I love sort of learning like, oh, like why would he call that cyclopean? Like, oh, well, it means this specific thing. And I think that like one interesting thing that a reader could get is some understanding of like why the stuff is evocative if you do stop and look up like what things mean. Because I definitely had to a few times be like, I've never seen that word ever in my life. And then it was like fun to be like, okay, like I can see what he's doing here. And I can see a lot of modern editors and writers being like, are you showing off? And it's like, no, this has a specific like connotation as well as like a denotation. And like, that's really interesting. And I think like getting used to that as a reader is something that I wish that more people were interested in, especially now, like if you have like a Kindle and you can just click on a word and it's like, that's what like, it's right there. So like do it.
Yeah. But that specificity is part of what evokes so much here, is because it is so particular about what he's trying to say. Yeah. Prashanth?
I think Molly stole my answer.
All right.
Sorry.
No, it's all good.
Nah, I'm just joking. Yeah, it's all fine. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, we're in agreement then.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. So thank you to everyone who has been with us today. Thank you so much, JM, Molly, Prashanth, for an amazing and excellent discussion. Reminder that you can follow NESS on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky if you would like to know when the next book club is going to be held and what story we are going to be reading. I have been your host once again, Valerie Valdes. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell you all where you can find them online, starting with JM.
All right, you can find me online in several places. First of all, there's my Amazon page, JM Clarke. You can find me there. I have multiple series there. My Sword and Sorcery series. You can find my short stories in Book of Blades and New Edge of Sword and Sorcery, but my Sword and Sorcery series of novels are going to be published in 2025. So look forward to those. I also have a Patreon under JM Clarke as well, though I'm waiting to get my next story up on there, as well as I am on Facebook, JM Clarke Author. That's where you can find me.
Awesome. Prashanth?
I am on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. You can always Google the Spice Gate to see more about my debut novel. I've had short stories in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, The Three-Lord Burning Eye, Dark Matter, Asimov's FNSF. So yeah, I mean, if you want a link for all those stories, you can find them on, what do you call that? The link tree. Yeah, I have a link tree on Instagram that kind of directs you to all the stories. But yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Molly?
I'm sorry. I just get really excited to hear Three Low Burning Eye because I'm like, Andrew is
It's
like
an amazing magazine.
It's so cool, and he's been doing it for so long, and I really love it getting recognition because it really deserves it. But like, yeah, he's a bud of mine, and it's just like, yes, Three Low Burning Eye. But yeah, as terms of where to find me, I am on these days. I am on Blue Sky. I'm no longer on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, but I don't tend to accept a lot of requests there. Like Instagram is probably the easiest place to find me. I also have Patreon. And yeah, like I have some short fiction up online. I think I have like an updated bibliography on my terrible ancient website that needs to be updated, but I'm around. It's pretty easy to find my stuff. And then yeah, like if you're a subscriber to New Edge, then you'll see my new story next month. So that's really exciting.
Massive shout out to writers with updated websites. How do you do it? You are the true sorcerers. Your dark magic is
right.
a lot. I'm Valerie Valdes. Once again, you can find me at valerievaldes.com. All relevant links to all things are located there. But thank you again, everyone, so much for being here. This was a wonderful discussion, and hope to see you all at the next book club. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.